Today I have a good friend of mine, Nick, on the show today. A little bit of background about Nick before we go ahead and get started. So Nick is a software engineer who loves to cook and is a really active person. You'll see this man running, record-breaking marathon times on, broken knees, broken limbs. And, when we're in a current kind of normal state of things, you'll often find him traveling around the world. So I'm super excited to have Nick on the show today. I've known Nick, we actually went to college together. And so we've known each other for about 4 or 5 years. In both of our views, I'm sure we're thinking too many years instead, knowing how much we've gotten to know each other. But I'm super excited to have Nick on the show today.
Yeah. Hey, Shad. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, kind of give a little bit of further background of when we met. So we met as part of like a club on campus in college, and that kind of led to us going through the organization, kind of leading different committees in that organization and leading the organization as a whole. And then from there, kind of towards the end of my time, at least in college, we kind of lived together in a house filled with people that were part of this organization. So we have a lot of really great memories to look back upon. We kind of talked about a lot of things in regards to, relationships, life, just, things when we were in school, trying to give each other advice and everything. So I'm super excited to kind of talk to Nick today about something that we've been talking about more recently amongst ourselves and with some other friends in regards to kind of generational issues and how we go about communicating across different generations. So I just want to go ahead and kind of dive straight on in, Nick, and just kind of understand, how have you kind of managed your own communication style when you look at, people from different generation from us. So like in the professional setting, in your family setting, in your social setting, how has that kind of communication style worked for you with people who are both older, in an older generation than you, as well as like a younger generation from you?
Yeah. I mean, I think like it's interesting because really, at least for me, the way like I interact with other generations is really much like from how I was raised with my family, right? So like, for example, within my family, it's like pretty like traditional Asian family, like immigrants from Vietnam. So like, I guess I'm like first or second generation or whatever. So for the most part, it's like still pretty traditional. Like you don't talk back to your like elders. You have to respect everyone, like you still call everyone by like their appropriate titles. But I think that like creates a situation where like now that like, especially I'm getting like older, it becomes harder to I guess like still play that like same subservient role that you should play, right? Like when you're younger, it's very easy for you to just be like, okay, like I'm gonna respect my elders no matter what. Like they say this, they must be right. Whereas like nowadays, like I'm finding myself in positions where like I'm trying to like be more vocal about my opinions. It's like I still have to be able to like convey those without like overstepping the line, right?
Right.
So I think like that's been more of like the issue, not issue, but that's been more of like the difficulty in communication. I guess that's like more like my family side, and I guess like with like the way I interact with other people outside my family, it's like pretty much like the same, right? Like because like for example, like the way I speak to my manager would be exactly the same way. Like I try to voice my opinion, but I like make sure like I don't overstep any lines. Whereas like I've like seen other people and the way they talk to my manager, and they're very direct. Like they don't give, they don't care at all. They just tell him straight up like that's a bad idea. Like this is a stupid idea. Let's not do it. Whereas like I feel like for me, that's not something I'm able to do.
So how much of that is a function of kind of, I guess, the societal structure you're working within, or how much of that is just your own self-belief in terms of what you can and cannot do? And do you find that kind of as a gray area where those two ideas kind of mesh together into one in terms of how you go about deciding, there's a certain fine line I gotta make sure I don't overstep here?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I would say like most of like the pressure to like be respectful and things obviously comes from societal like I guess like societal beliefs versus my own like personal beliefs. So in the beginning it made sense to me, and I was like, oh yeah, like like F it, we don't need to like deal with societal beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just just live our own lives. Just let
Mm-hmm.
me be vocal about my opinion. But I think like the more time I spent like thinking about that, it kind of made sense for me to like find a balance, right? Because like as much as like sometimes I like feel like, certain things are like way too traditional, it makes sense to at least be like respectful towards those things. You know what I mean? And even though it's like giving up part of like my like ideas and like being able to like be vocal, it's like fine, because as long as like I'm being respectful, it's like I guess it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So do you feel as if sometimes that kind of line that you have to make sure that you don't step over is that kind of restricting some of your own self-identity exploration and expression, or do you feel as if that there is some sort of power that also comes from knowing your place in a certain social setting or group setting that does allow you to define a place for yourself and communicate effectively still within that defined role?
Yeah. I mean, I think really like what it boils down to is how, at least like, again, this is like all my experience. So I don't know how this like plays into other people's experiences, but like in my experience, like the way family has always been is like, obviously if you're younger, that doesn't just mean like, oh, like you're the younger one, but really it comes with like this mentality that because you're younger, that means like you don't know anything, right? Like where like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a tradition of like, oh, like older people know everything. So like
Mm-hmm.
for you to like question, for you to like talk back means like you're just being disrespectful because clearly you don't know anything because you're just too young.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in that sense, yeah, like it creates like this issue where it's like when you're trying to explain to them like the things that you want to do, right? Like let's say like you're like, oh, like I want to go, simple example, like you're like, oh, I want to go like snowboarding, right? And then they'll tell you like, no, you can't go snowboarding because the mountains are dangerous. You're gonna die. And then you have to like try like conveying to them like, no, that's like fine, right? Like it's not gonna happen. But the thing is like, no matter how much how much logic you have behind your argument, ultimately you always lose because the argument that you can't win is them just saying, well, you're younger, like you don't understand anything, right? So I think in that sense, it does create like this conflict where it's hard sometimes to um to feel like you can like be yourself or like pursue the things that you want to pursue. And obviously that's like a simple
Mm-hmm.
example, but you can see like how that extrapolates to like a lot of other parts, right?
Right. So that's a super interesting point because I think there's so many cases where, yeah, like you're working under the assumption that the younger individual in a certain setting doesn't have as much knowledge or information about the certain topic on hand,
Yeah.
but in reality that may or may not be true. So how do you kind of give yourself the push to just say, you know what, maybe they don't have all the information and I can make this decision for myself, whether that means I have to, and kind of what decision do you take? Sometimes you have to like walk away from that setting and
Mhm.
situation and say, I have enough belief in my knowledge and, my understanding of the certain topic at hand. Or do you somehow find a way to work out the compromise? Like, how does your identity play into
Yeah.
that situation? Like, how strongly do you believe in that self knowledge that you have?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think like the way I approach it nowadays that I realize is that like the first thing is that really like I just try to give what my like what let's say like people in my family say less value, not less value, but like I try to give them less power over me, if that makes sense. Like I think like half of like the reason why it's like kind of like hard to communicate with them is because like I give power to whatever they say, right? So if they like automatically say like, okay, well, like you're younger, you don't know anything, or like blah blah blah. Eventually, I'll give in and I'll just say like, okay, like you know what, like yeah, they're right, right? Like they have to be right. So then, and then it becomes like, oh, like I don't want to like make them upset, blah blah blah. Fine, I'll just listen to them. So like lately, it's been more of like this navigation of trying to just like say what like I want to do and just like not listen, right? Like so, it's not no longer like I'm asking for permission for anything or I'm asking for acceptance. I'm just telling them out of like courtesy, like this is what I'm gonna do, right? And like hopefully you can support me, and like if you can support me, great. If you don't want to support me, well, too bad. Like this is what I'm gonna do. And it's obviously like very difficult, right? Because like this is like kind of counterintuitive to like everything you do when you're growing up. But I realized like
Mm-hmm.
now that's kind of like the only way to move forward. And like, yeah, it obviously creates like a lot of friction and like problems sometimes. But I've, yeah, I realized like you just kind of have to like trust yourself and just like go for it. Right. And like, even if you're wrong, at the very least, you knew like you were acting on your best judgment at that time. Right. And there's
Mm-hmm.
like nothing like you can really regret about that. Whereas like, yeah, if you just give in to what other people are talking about, then I mean, yeah, you never know what like could have happened. Right.
Right. Yeah. I think that idea of just letting go of kind of the
Yeah.
expectation that people have of you is super important. That I think us as, especially millennials, have not necessarily millennials at whole, but like us particularly have a tough time coming to terms
Yeah.
with. Especially, I think one of the things I'm curious to know your own take on is kind of the immigrant mentality in terms of like how immigrants versus like, their kids. Like obviously we're both like, children of immigrants, and there's a certain
Yeah.
kind of narrative that kind of feeds into children of immigrants, as well as kind of looking at the Western society versus the rest of the world in terms of how they go about thinking from a collectivist versus individualistic perspective. There's obviously a lot of conflict, and it's like I'm just curious to know what your take is on that, in terms of how you also have that color your own ideas about how you go about navigating that communication you have.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like a very interesting dynamic, right? When you have immigrant parents and then you yourself are like, like the first one that should like really grow up in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just because like there's like obviously an immigrant mentality, right? Like when they're like coming over here, the only thing they're thinking about is like, all right, like I need to establish a life here. And I like will probably like not find success in my own life, but I'm gonna work so damn hard that by the time like my kids like become like, like my age or whatever here, they're gonna be so successful. Like I'm gonna set them up for success. So in that sense, it's like this really weird situation where it's like we look at a lot of immigrant parents, the way like they view value in their own lives is not through like the things they do, but exactly like based off of what their kids are doing. You know what I mean? Like they find value in their life because their kid went to Harvard. Like that's it. Like nothing else in their own life. Like they're not like us where they're like, oh, like I love my life because, every morning I get to go on a run, I do races, or like I love cooking. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, like none of that's true for them. It's just a working mentality to make sure their kids are successful. And I think like that's where I guess the conflict starts happening with them and their
Right.
kid, because it's the expectation that they have for what they think success means versus like what their kid ultimately grows up with and like wants to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where all like the tension is, if you think about it, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
every parent wants their kid to go Harvard, be a lawyer, be a doctor,
Mm-hmm.
not every kid wants to go to Harvard or like, be a lawyer. And I think like that's really where this generational discrepancy comes from, is what like the parents expect, and also but then like the kids like trying to build their own lives. Yeah.
So when you finally kind of come to terms with that conflict, how much greater sense of relief and power do you personally feel? Is there still something always kind of niggling away in the back of your mind, thinking, like you were saying, this is how I grew up, and
Yeah.
now I'm kind of detaching myself from those like cultural values in a sense, but at the same time you want to kind of stay close at home to those values. Like how much power does that give you, being able to just say, this is who I am. This is kind of the way I want to navigate this entire narrative of my life. But at the same time, how much does kind of that niggling idea in the back of your mind affect you? Or does it come to a point where it's like, it's very minimal at this point? It really doesn't affect me.
Yeah. I mean, so I would say that, yeah, like coming to terms with something like this brings a lot of relief, because I think it clarifies a lot of, at least again, this is like more of like my experience. I don't know how this translates to other people's experiences. But in my opinion, if you grew up in and with like immigrant parents, that's like the first obstacle in your own life to figuring out your own identity and like what you want to do in life. Because no matter what, it's like, at least again, for me, there's always like a nagging voice in your head, right? Telling you exactly what your Asian parents are telling you, right? Because basically they have like embedded that voice into you. And
Mm-hmm.
so, no, like if you don't try to like figure out where that voice came from, or you don't try to make peace with that voice. You're just going to keep going on and trying to make decisions like that you want to do. And you're always going to feel at conflict with yourself. But in reality, it's like not in conflict with yourself. It's just like the way you grew up, like those like voices are still in your head, and you need to find a way to like not even just like suppress them, because I don't like think things like that is possible. It's more like you have to acknowledge the voices are there, but just like ignore it, you know, and just be like, nope, like that's not my voice. Like I don't care about those things. But obviously, like it always still kind of nags at you every now and then, right? But I think like the other thing that helped me was realizing that, like, yes, Asian parents want like this. They want like this like success that like wants to give you this level of success, right? But in reality, it's not the way like I thought about it was like it's not really about just success, right? Like this title and stuff. The underlying part of all this is like they just really want you to be happy, right? In their eyes, it's just like happiness can only be obtained via status, money, etc. So as long as you are pursuing, the way I think about it is like, as long as you're pursuing a path in your life where you know, like you are going to be happy, and you can then demonstrate to your parents, like, yeah, like, look how happy I am. And they can also see that you are happy. And I think like, that's fine. Right. At the end of the day, like later down, like on the, like down the road, I think like you can make peace with your parents that way.
Right.
Yeah.
So kind of shifting gears, I'm kind of interested. It's somewhat related in terms of kind of the communication style, right? Between kind of the older generation, like take, for example, our parents and ourselves. How much do you think the way technology kind of plays into that way in which we communicate, right? Because like you said, parents want us to be happy, or, you know, people that are older than us, just simply put, want us to be happy. And it's really, and they grew up in an age where there was no technology. So it was a very authentic version of seeing whether or not you are happy, versus now it's like, oh, you know, obviously people go off and do their own thing. They're like in different states or different countries doing their own thing. And like, here's a picture of me being super happy, kind of where I am in life. But, you know, there's the whole stigma of how our generation growing up in tech, like this technological age, there's like mental health issues. And so parents can't really see that. They're like, oh yeah, my son, my daughter, they're doing super fine. Like, look at them, you know? So there's kind of a disconnect because there's the lack of authenticity, and maybe there's an issue with like us and our generation wanting to hide behind technology and like, and wanting to avoid the issues. Though I think the pandemic kind of has eradicated that issue, where now people are kind of coming to terms and wanting to have a more authentic relationship and interaction with others. So I'm just curious your take, being someone who like knows a great deal about technology. Like, what do you think technology has in terms of a role to play in that disconnect?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way to describe technology is not that like it's a replacement for authentic experiences or relationships, but merely it serves as a way to push those experiences to extremes, right? And what I mean by that is, on one end of the spectrum, you can have like super authentic experiences online, right? Things that like you couldn't do outside, like in the normal world. For example, like we can now talk to, you know, like all our friends around the world, and all it takes is us just clicking a button. And that really does provide like pretty like good like communication, right? If you think about it, back then, all they had was like mail, right? Like they literally just had to write mail. Like that was not a good way of communicating. But on the other side of that, like the more like, I guess, nefarious side of that is like, yeah, like it does create situations where then we have very inauthentic experiences, right? And these inauthentic experiences, you know, are obviously things like, you know, like posting on Instagram, or like just like, you know what I mean? Like people going out. Quick tangent, because I think it's like such an interesting thing.
Go ahead.
Like, so there was like an Alton Brown interview where he talked about how social media has changed the landscape of food, like food culture. And at first I thought it was like interesting. I was like, yeah, like how the hell does like social media change the way we perceive food, right? And he talked about, because of Instagram and Facebook and like Snapchat, the way people's expectations of food now is completely focused on the aesthetics and appearances of food rather than the experience of a food and the taste of a food. And the more that like sank into me, the more I thought that was true, right? Because if you think about it, like you've seen all these like, you know, Instagram pictures, all these like, you know, cool like hipster places where they have like ice cream that like looks a certain way, or they have like all these things that are shaped really cool. But when we actually go there and we try it, A, we're like, this is overpriced as shit. And B, it just like doesn't taste good. But for some reason, these places are so hyped up. And then because they're part of like Instagram culture, it becomes part of our food culture, right? It becomes something that people talk about where they're like, oh, you're going to like, you know, like LA, man, you got to try like that churro over like the ice cream, right? But it's like, but that's like not an authentic experience, right? Like, for example, like if I were to tell someone like, you're coming to LA, all right, dude, like we got to hit up like, you know, good Asian food. We got to hit up like taco trucks. Like these are the authentic food places that people used to talk about because like of like the taste and the experience, not because of like purely the aesthetics or the looks. So I guess like that's just like a good, so I like, you know, I think that's just a good metaphor, or a good like, it just demonstrates really the issue at large, right? Where like we do very simple things on like social media, but really it creates very inauthentic experiences. And ultimately, I think the issue with these things is like people use it as a way to mask like problems that they're actually facing, right? Because it gives them immediate gratification. And so it's easy for you to like use these platforms as ways to like either like fill your time or like find like self-esteem, or like, you know, people to like, you know, just upvote your comments so you feel good. But like that's just like hiding all the issues that you're really facing, right? Like where like it's identity crisis, you're just being lost in your life, you don't know what to like pursue. Yeah, sorry, that was like a lot of answers, but
no, I think that's good. And that was something that I think even I personally, I mean, I'm sure all of us have gone through, like, it's like we go through the phase, like, especially in our generation, oh, social media, you know, these platforms, super cool. Let me just kind of get on it. And, you know, you get hooked on it. And then that's kind of masking, like you were saying, the issues at hand. And I think that also plays a really big role in terms of the way we go about communicating across different generations. Cause I think it's played a role such that it's a crux almost, like this is the crux we can use to say, okay, we are happy. We are exactly what the, you know, older generations want from us, even younger generations, what have you. But in reality, that's not the case. So it's like, how do we bring that authenticity back to the table? Like, what are ways of like the past, like of older generations, and like ways of like our current generation, or even people who are younger than us? What kind of methodologies or kind of ways of thinking and communicating do you think we need to adopt from, you know, generations different from ourselves to kind of give that more authentic experience at whole?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's just like, that's a pretty hard question, because I think like the simplest answer to all this, which I don't think is necessarily like the right answer for everyone, right? Like, again, like I think social media like has its purposes, right? Like there are situations where like it's fine, right? Like it makes sense to use, like, you know, but it really just depends on the situation. But I think the way, like the solution to most of this is like, I mean, we like seen the trend everywhere, right? It's like, yeah, just like delete Facebook, right? Just delete your social media. And I think the fear that people have when they first do that, it's like when you ask them like, all right, like, why don't you just delete it? Right? Like, why do you continue to engage in these platforms? And the first answer that they always give you is, well, I won't be able to connect with my friends.
Right.
Like, I'm going to be missing out. Like people are going to be sending me shit. And then the more you think about that answer, though, you're like, but how many of these people who are like liking your post, for example, do you actually talk to? Right. So the way I like to think about that is, yeah, like you can just like delete these platforms and instead just use like more like personal forms of communication, right? Just like if you really like missed your friends, or you really want to connect with your friends, then just message them, you know, message them personally, be like, hey, like how, like what is going on with your life, you know? And that creates a way for you to have like better like conversations with people. But also I think it takes away from what social media is bad, like that is bad about social media, which is just like there's way too much content that you're consuming all at once. You know what I mean? It kind of like floods your brain, and it's just, it's not good, man.
Right.
But yeah, basically, I think like the simple answer, at least like the answer like I came to, is just, yeah, just message people, right? Like realistically, like how many of your friends on social media that are liking your stuff are you actually like A, friends with, but also B, would you even care to talk to, right? Because if you did care to talk to them, then just message them. Exactly. Right? Like what's the point of like sending this picture and then in your head be like, no, I'm like sending it out so like they can see it, but it's like, who's they, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious because I think that another thing is kind of going back to the idea of like different generations. One is like the simple answer for like our generations, yeah, just to message someone like via
Yeah.
text, via some sort of messaging app, or the older generation sometimes will, given the fact that they didn't grow up in a technological age, they would just be like in person. Obviously, now with the pandemic,
Yeah.
proceed with caution, but in person, have that conversation. So, in your opinion, is there kind of what are the pros and cons of just messaging someone versus actually doing an in-person conversation in like a safe situation? Obviously, kind of what are the merits of each of those?
Yeah. I mean, obviously people talk a lot about, like how like messaging people is like still kind of like not like in person, like not personal. So like obviously it doesn't like promote like good social behaviors, like things like that, blah, blah, blah. But honestly, I think like if when it comes down to like if you're just messaging your friends, like actual friends, like not strangers,
Yeah,
then
yeah.
I think in a way they're one and the same nowadays. And I think that's more of a reflection of just differing generation, like generational differences, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but like a good example of this now is that like now that there's like a pandemic and stuff, like my grandparents, that's actually like the ways that they communicate with their friends now. It's like they message each other.
Oh,
They're
really?
like on their like messaging platform. Somehow they all learn to use messaging platforms, and they're like
Uh-huh.
sending each other like news articles. I mean, like every so often they'll call each other and be like, "Oh, do you see my message?" Blah blah blah. But
Mm-hmm.
like I think that's becoming. But that only shows you that like it's in a way, there are parts of social media that are perfectly normal, and really they just represent an evolution in the way that we do communicate as we like progress, right, in technology and so forth. So I mean, personally, yeah, I think messaging is fine as long as like it's being done in a very like authentic way. Like you're not trying to hide yourself, you're not trying to like pretend to be something that you're not. Like as long as you're messaging people the
Mm-hmm.
same way you're talking to people in normal life, then yeah, it's fine.
Right, exactly. And I think now we have like the platforms, especially like these video conferencing tools where you can
Yeah.
actually have the actual conversation kind of quote unquote live as if you're there with the person, but at the same time, with the added benefit, oh, I can't see someone across the world, due to certain
Yeah.
constraints. So I think, and this is the authenticity, right? You're not hiding behind, some sort of, device or something. And how you were saying sometimes messages are kind of cryptic, like what does that exactly mean? Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
meaning behind the message isn't conveyed, whereas now it's like facial expressions, actually kind of seeing each other, and
Yep.
the way we're communicating, I think, is super beneficial. So yeah, I'm super glad we had this conversation. I know you probably are pretty busy, so I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But though I know you and I can probably go on for another hour and a half, we probably will after this. But at the end of each episode, I like to kind of go through this final segment called the 3 keys to relationships. So these are 3 questions I ask guests in to kind of gain insight in terms of their own relationship philosophy. So I'm kind of curious to get your answers on these questions, and you can elaborate as much as you want. These aren't like quick fire questions or anything. So the first question I have is, what's your number one relationship red flag? And this goes for like any type of relationship, friends, family, romantic partners, professional colleagues, what have you.
Yeah. I think so. I guess like I I don't really like the way people describe red flags nowadays, because I think I know this is supposed to be a simple answer, but
No,
I guess
no,
it's
go
not
on, go
so
on.
much. Yeah. But like I don't like the way people describe red flags nowadays, because it kind of like feeds into like the same mindset, right, that people have, where it's like, oh, like there should be general things that we all accept as like being true.
Mm-hmm.
But what I've
Mm-hmm.
like learned from my experience is like everyone has different red flags, but that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we're all
Right,
different people. So we
right.
should all have different tolerances of things that like we are either okay or like not okay to,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think so. I think it's like really when it comes to like red flags, it's just like, yeah, man, like you just gotta discover for yourself like what are the limits you're willing to go for, not just like in not like in whatever relationship this is, right? You have to be able to understand yourself and like what you are okay with and then what you're not okay with. And so I guess, you don't need to listen to anyone else. If anyone else is like, oh, like it's a red flag that he didn't, like that he didn't, I don't know, like text you back within 1 minute. That's a big red flag.
Yeah.
And then you're just like, but like for you, like, let's say like you're the person too who doesn't text back that often, right? Then why is that a red flag for you? You know what I mean? Because that's like not equal expectation. So again, like it's really dependent on like who you are. And I think like that's why like in relationships, it's like relationships at the end of the day just are two people with their differences trying to find a way to make it work. And once they make it work and they find like, and like after like they try to make it work and both parties like figure out like, oh yeah, like I'm happy with the compromise that we are at in this middle, then yeah, congratulations. Like you are in a happy relationship, right? But like, that's like all it is. So when it comes to red flags, it's about that process, right? About seeing what their differences are, what your differences are, and seeing where or not you could come to a compromise that you're both happy with.
No, I really like that answer. I think, the idea of red flag almost kind of draws kind of an absolute sort of connotation where for some people, like there are certain qualities they don't want to kind of mess with in a relationship from the get-go, whereas others, it's like you said, like a compromise. So I totally agree. And I actually really like that, kind of angle on the idea and the question itself. So the second question I have is kind of the converse of that. What's the most underrated quality you think when it comes to relationships?
Let's see. I don't know if it's like underrated, but I think nowadays, especially, it's probably just appreciating the insignificant days, right? I think, again, maybe it's just like an issue of like, not just like, social media, but I mean, mainly social media, right? Like how we see celebrities portray like their relationships, or like how even like like maybe some of your friends do it, right? Like they take pictures with their boyfriend, girlfriends, like they're going places around the world. They show like all the great food they're eating. And that creates an expectation that like, oh, like within relationships, like this is like, what defines a good relationship. But I think if anything else, those days should not matter as much, right? Like, yeah, those are like fun memories to have and fun experiences to have. But the most underrated part of relationships are just the days where you do nothing, right? And just like how you feel during those days. Like if you just feel like super comfortable with that person, right? It's just like, then like those are like great days to have, like to appreciate, right? Yeah, basically like my point is just like the insignificant days. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because those more often than not will take up like 90% of your livelihood, whereas like the other 10%, it's like you only get that 10% of the time. So what does that leave the other 90%? So I completely agree, and like I think both you and I have come to the point in life where like we enjoy the 90% more than the 10%. We enjoy going on those kind of like extravagant trips, like if we can, but like we much rather enjoy the 90% because we understand this is kind of where the meat life is anyway. So
it's also like if you don't learn to appreciate the insignificant moments, not just in a relationship, but just like in life in general, it creates like a deep unhappiness where because you're not like constantly experiencing these thrills, you're in this mood where you're like, oh, like what is my life then? But like that's like the point, like there's not like life is life. Like I think you just have to accept that the majority of your life is like nothing's going to happen, right? Like there's not going to be like a roller coaster outside your house every day where you can just ride. So it's about you creating significance in these insignificant times, right? Like for example, if you're just at home all day and you're doing nothing, then like make something of that day. You know what I mean? It could be anything. Like it doesn't need to be like, oh, like some crazy goal. It could just be like, oh yeah, like today, like I am just going to enjoy TV. And then to yourself, you're going to be like, that was great. Like that was a great day. Like I was able to like finish a TV show, or like, oh, be like, oh, I'll cook myself a nice meal today, right? Or like, oh, I'll message a friend and we'll see like what they're up to. But it's about like finding things that make you happy, no matter how like unadventurous they may seem, as long as they can give you some like level of meaning, then I think like those are like good days.
Yeah, exactly. And so the third and final question is, what is your own kind of mantra or slogan when it comes to managing relationships? So I can kind of give you kind of like what this show kind of centers around is the idea that we don't make relationships, but that we make relationships better. That's kind of the slogan or mantra this show is all about. So I'm curious kind of if you had to come up with some sort of slogan or mantra for how you manage relationships, what would that kind of boil down to?
Yeah. I mean, I think everyone says it, but at the end of the day, I really think it's communication, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not communication in the sense that it's like it's a communication like two ways. First, it's like with whoever is in this relationship with you, right? No matter what it is, like it's a romantic one or a professional one, doesn't matter. You have to be able to convey everything to this person, right? I mean, obviously you have to find like, some filter, but like it's not just like happy thoughts, it's about unhappy thoughts too. It's about like
Mm-hmm.
trying to actually like say all these things and not be afraid of like what they might say back. Because again, like the point of like all relationships in my view is everyone is like different people and you're trying to just find a compromise. And as long as you can find a compromise that both parties are happy with, and like and maybe even that compromise makes you guys both like better people, then I think that's all you're asking for, right? Like that's like the goal of relationships. So that means you have to be able to like express all your unhappiness and your happiness to this
Mm-hmm.
person in order to like achieve that. And I think the other side of the communications, like on top of that, like you just have to keep like communicating with yourself, man. Like I think like
Yeah.
life and like the way we navigate relationships is ultimately also about the way we navigate our own self-identity, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's like you can't be happy if you're with someone else unless you can figure out how to be happy with yourself. But
Yep.
because like we're constantly like growing as individuals, like we are constantly learning more and more about ourselves, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's about like learning about like how you're changing and what your beliefs are and like all that, and then being able to communicate that with whoever else is in this relationship with you. They communicate back with you. You guys like both hopefully like the differences hopefully come together and make something even better. And then like that's the way I view like relationships.
No,
And
that's
again, like if communication fails and then you go downwards, and like that's just how it ended up being, right? Like as
mm-hmm.
long as you were
Mm-hmm.
truthful to yourself and like this is who I am, these are like the values I have, these are my red flags, and it doesn't mesh well with the other person, then you can say like fine, then like it's fine, like that's when the relationship like goes apart.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, completely agree. And I think that kind of ties things up together really well for this episode in terms of communication. At the end of the day is super important, but it's something that's often really overlooked in terms of
Oh,
understanding
yeah.
different idiosyncrasies, looking at generational differences, looking at cultural differences, societal differences, etc. So, I'm super glad we had this conversation today. And I know we talk about this often, just kind of offline, but I hope that the audience can kind of really take a lot of different, tidbits from this episode. There's a lot of cool things that I think you mentioned that the audience can really kind of learn from, and I learned from you a lot this episode. So I'm glad that you were able to come on the episode, even though you're probably thinking like, "Oh, well, what could I have possibly learned from you?" No, trust me, there's a lot of things I've learned. So yeah, thanks Nick for coming on the show today, and I'm super excited to see how the audience kind of reacts to this, because I think this is kind of a really interesting topic that I'd love to go more into detail with, maybe with you or with others kind of in the future. So definitely would love to have you back. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shad.
Hey everyone, my name is Shadman Rahman, and thanks for tuning in to my YouTube channel today. I hope you found this episode of the Between Us podcast enjoyable, and that you're walking away feeling entertained, inspired, and/or motivated. If you particularly enjoyed this episode, please go ahead and smash the like button down below and leave your thoughts in the comments section. And if you'd like to go ahead and keep up with the podcast, go ahead and follow our social media. And please go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, so that way you can find out about new episodes as soon as they're released. Until next time, everyone, Take care, and we'll see you all in the next episode.